We'll be moving now on to our next speaker, Irene Solaiman. Irene Solaiman is head of global policy at Hugging Face. She leads public policy and conducts social impact research. Irene also serves on the partnership of AI's Policy Steering Committee, the Center for Democracy and Technology's AI Governance Lab Advisory Committee, and Aspen Digital's AI Election Advisory Council. Her research includes social impact, value alignment, strategies to combat misuse, and responsible releases. Irene's talk is titled An Insider's Outlook on Global AI Coordination. Welcome, Irene.
All right. Hey, everyone. Yep, I'm a technologist. There it is. All right. Hi, I'm Irene Solaiman. I lead policy at Hugging Face, and I've been very fortunate to be on the steering committee for the French Summit upcoming this week. So I wanted to dive into and really be helpful to this audience. I think we've got a broad array of backgrounds, but really think about how research backgrounds can contribute to policy, what policymakers should be taking from researchers. It's incredible to see so many people here. And also I think some people are just in town for this conference, which I love to see. It's been a huge journey of melding different practices. I should have pressed. There we are. So we'll talk about, in the context of the week coming up, the many side events, what researchers can contribute and what is most helpful in translating. A lot of my research and a lot of what Hugging Face works on is openness. I want to think about types of openness, the utility of openness, and think more about, is open actually accessible and available is not the same thing as what is accessible to many different peoples. And then we're going to talk about the world, because it feels pretty relevant in our current environment. We'll talk about DeepSeek, I promise. So hot right now. And we're going to talk about it, everyone. So first, for the context of the summit, some of what we've been talking about in the steering committee, this is not official, but we've been having these themes around openness, sustainability, and global inclusion. Openness as a word has really come into the fore in the last year or so, and I found it means different things to different people. So I want to dig into what that could mean and what we've really, oh no, the GIF isn't working, and it's a good one, and some of you have seen it. We've seen some pretty darn impressive open weight models, and I think some of the best ways to show progress, and I know it's not a new thing to say that progress is moving extremely fast, it feels really jarring when you're seeing these releases real time on the Hugging Face Hub. When the model now known as Crayon, formerly DALL-E Mini, was released, it was kind of what I felt was one of the golden ages of AI. It was very memey, very blurby, and this, you might have seen this really dopey Will Smith eating spaghetti. But now, oh alas, the GIFs aren't working. We have these open weight models on the hub. Hunyuan came out from Tencent this year, and it's an extremely impressive video open weight model. Part of why I like showing images and videos, if they were to work, is I think it really shows you the quality of accuracy in ways that are much harder to determine, and we have, as you know, a variety of benchmarks to try to figure this out for language, which has a lot of investment, but also what I'll talk about are evaluations. The way that we evaluate these types of image, video models that often different types of people's research and deploy is quite disparate in the level of literature that we have. So the open questions that are continually arising, and I expect to arise in the next week, is, of course, how do you create agile policy? How do you ensure, I couldn't have seen Hunyuan. We have quite a bit of insight, and we have a team working on Chinese releases, but the level of open weight releases in the past few months has been just astonishing. And who is able to build is one of the biggest questions. We've been able to build better infrastructure. And I think especially with DeepSeek, and we're going to talk more about it, I promise, there's more hope being given to people outside of the global north, outside of the more developed world, who can create highly performant and easily runnable, easily servable models. And one of the bigger questions sitting in policy world as well is not just what should be disclosed, but how do you disclose it? Some of the areas of research that has been most impactful that I've seen, I like to bucket, and maybe this can be helpful, and I tend to update this framework. You can think about the software, hardware, and institutional. We've talked a lot in the policy world around hardware and export controls these days, but even institutional, better ways to bridge civil society, bridge with industry, have better sharing among industry groups is still a huge open question of how to do that meaningfully. Trust is much easier to build person to person than it is to build institution or government to government. And then on the functional side, so you can look at the top section and then the bottom section. On the functional side, even going into the socio-technical and doing what is notoriously hard interdisciplinary work on, for example, social impact, which my incredibly crack team has been working really hard on. The way that you look at disparate performance, some of the folks that have been working on evals have a pretty strong technical background, but it's been harder to find folks who have more of a specialized sectoral background to give that kind of insight into how to build those types of evaluations. We've seen integration of some of the best research work into the International AI Safety Report that just came out ahead of this summit, the UN's Governing AI for Humanity, and of course these can be more specialized, as with the famous NTA report on open model weights. So I hope this can help researchers as you're thinking about how can I make my research impactful for these types of policy actions. There's a way to be reactionary, and I think there's some areas, for example, with the widely available model weights that can tell you maybe I should think really hard about what that means in today's context. But also, a lot of the work that's being reflected in these reports has been ongoing for at least over a decade. So keep on at it, I believe. But it's really this is really hot right now. I wish that my builds were here so you see this all at once. But there's just so many amazing independent work happening, particularly around evaluations. I think one of the most impactful areas is to understand how models work, and not just the most highly performant ones. But as I said earlier, around these different modalities, one of the biggest insights I found from these independent groups is how difficult it is to create a robust and shareable evaluation repository. I do think Helm is net great and has been really helpful, and has also been a lesson for me as we're trying to build evaluation repositories. You can host test sets, but to make it really easy and low barrier for different groups to be able to analyze, run, and create a bucket of an evaluation repository hasn't been really functional lately. I think that the government bodies, such as especially the UK ACE, has really done exceptional work and has shown that you really can bring top technical talent into government and really launch these inspect evals and the great work that Singapore is doing. Whoa. Oh, there we go. How do I go back? There, nope. Technology, everyone. Some of the cracked work that my team has been doing is also thinking about how do we report the results of evaluations. There's also not really a standardized way to do that. There's no good way to determine what is a broader impact of evaluations we should be running. How should we communicate that to both researchers and to users, to people who maybe don't understand, and it's not their job to understand the in-depth results of evaluations. Make that really easy to parse and really easy to compare, especially at a qualitative level. Leaderboards are immensely helpful, even at the product level, but when you're just trying to compare safety and more of the social impact side, qualitative evaluations are really helpful, and they don't rank really well. So if you're interested in that, we're going to be launching a coalition in a couple of weeks working on the science of evaluations. Do talk to me later if that's interesting to you. Had to give the pitch. And now I want to dig into openness. About a few months ago, the proposed definition for open source was released by the Open Source Initiative. And this is one step towards ensuring that when we talk about open source, we have key terminology. We understand that's inclusive of data, of code, of all the components that go into development and release. But it also sometimes means how widely are you distributing those model weights? It can refer to transparency, as seen with the Stanford Transparency Index. I highly encourage you to see Rishi's talk later today. But this is a level of openness. And then it can mean the dimensions of openness. So this is the work from Mozilla a few months ago that looks more into the open source definition. What are those many components? And also, what are adjacent components? This is really fixated on the system themselves, but are you releasing your test sets? Are you releasing test train overlap? Is a huge part of why we're investing in openness and why it's such a central marker of the French summit. Part of why Hugging Face has looked at openness so deeply is because of how much it interacts with science. And AI is fundamentally a science. We're doing scientific work such as reproducibility. This is the Hugging Face team is working on an open R1 where open weight models are generally really helpful, but DeepSeek did not release their training pipeline or their training data. So the Hugging Face team has been working on replicating that, which is super helpful from a scientific perspective to be able to get other eyes. There's a lot to work on with peer review. I know many of you have thoughts on that. But also to be able to communicate those results and be able to have that verified by others from many different disciplines. Many of you might have seen this work that I published 2 years ago, and something that I hadn't quite envisioned when I wrote this is this spectrum of release where it's not just open and closed, but especially in the last few weeks, I've not quite seen the level of broader integration of especially open weight models into global infrastructure. And I don't see this addressed enough at either the research or the policy level. Open model weights have stability in the version that you're using. You can integrate them very directly, and especially with the highly performant small models that we're seeing, for example, with Mistral and of course DeepSeek. We're going to talk about DeepSeek, everybody, is how easily you can integrate that into low-cost infrastructure, relatively low-cost infrastructure. This is a huge part of even soft power globally and how some countries are interacting with the world. At Hugging Face, since we have a bit of a lens on especially open releases, we have over 1 million public models on the hub. And you can check this out. We did a kind of interactive year in review. Some of the most used models and downloaded models on the hub are not actually the highest performing ones. So you'll see Llama 405B, which is an incredible model, is pretty compute intensive to run and only accounts for less than 3% of the overall downloads on the hub, as opposed to Qwen 2.5, which is relatively recent on the hub, but extremely high performance and pretty small and pretty easy to run. This is the trend that we've been seeing over the past year, especially for researchers. Making models accessible and often making them smaller has gone a really long way. I don't know if this is reflected on here. I used to work in a past life on GPT-2, and even distilled GPT-2 remains one of the most popular models on the hub. So I'm gonna float some work that is undergoing peer review right now. I know that's a little bit of a faux pas, but if would love to hear some feedback on it, and if I'm feeling really crazy, I might put it on archive, so let me know. But as I've been talking about, if you have a really highly performant model, that doesn't inherently mean that it's accessible. This is what we've seen with 405B, this is what we've seen with some of the highest performing open weight models. And so we've been thinking about what makes a model available if you fully open weight it, if you release it, is not the same thing as whether it's accessible. I break this down into 3 components. One of the more, I think, pressing ones is resourcing, just due to cost. The level of compute that you need, the level of infrastructure that you need to spin up your own model is quite hard to do. So I want to ask the audience, how many of you have interacted with the language model through a user interface, like a ChatGPT? Almost everybody. And how many of you have spun up your own open weight model? A lot more than the policy session that I went to yesterday. Amazing. And then how many of you have done red teaming on a model? A good chunk of you. Interesting, less than the policy session I went to yesterday. And how many of you have done generative evaluations on a model without any filters, anything on top of it? Fewer, a lot fewer of you. I think this is a really key point that when people are examining models, there's a lot of model fixation, and only the people who have really spun up their own models, and I've only spun up the small ones, have an understanding of how difficult inference optimization is and how difficult it is to find exactly what you need to be able to run that. So this is when we're talking about resourcing. On the technical usability side, interfaces are great. User experience is a huge gain in how people are able to interact with models. It's part of why I think we're seeing models be so popular today. And these are the pros and cons that I've given you here. You can get a lot of broad users, but also that might mean that you reach some pretty sus people. We've seen, this is not to dunk on ChatGPT specifically, it just has enormous reach, and we've seen people misuse that because it's so accessible. With one of the January 1st attacks, I believe in Las Vegas, the attacker had consulted with ChatGPT purely because it's so low barrier to use. And when you're getting that huge volume, and so I talk about scale of access. When you're making it easier for people to access models and you're just reaching more people, and that's harder to manage. When you're fielding millions and millions of queries a day, you want to make your product usable, and you don't want to get a whole bunch of false positives. This is I think these are some of the areas that when we're talking about usability, we're also talking about how well does this scale. And this is the benefit. You're reaching so many people, you can benefit more people, but there is a downside to it. One area that I also think, specifically in France now, and we are reaching so much of the world here, is on utility. I realize it's a tough distinction between usability and utility. One example I give on the utility of languages is it's amazing how much work is going into low resource languages. Low resource languages are also really hard to monitor. And yes, you're reaching out to a whole group of people, but there's been really awful case studies, particularly on social media, of what happens when you don't have a robust monitoring system for a low resource language. So these are the kinds of usable, but could have a little stick behind it. And now moving on to the global outlook. What does this mean in the world today? This is also on the year in review. We've seen an immense amount of publications coming out of the US, but also a ton coming out of China. I had the absolute privilege of being in Shanghai with Concordia AI in July of last year. And something that was really notable is how much at the World AI Conference, enormous conference, was truly accessible to me as an English speaker who did not speak any Chinese. And that is not the case at some of these more Western AI conferences. We were at NeurIPS, we conducted our workshop only in English. Almost none of the main events have live translators at them. This level of accessibility and understanding what each other are doing, what different areas are doing, not just US and China, but also in Europe, is a huge barrier to not only being able to develop research that works for other people, but also understand what other people are looking at. On the Hugging Face leaderboard, this is just looking at the official providers. Chinese models have been top of the list for over a year now. We've seen, and I apologize, I put this a week ago. I know that's like months in AI time, so this is not looking at Tulu 3 from AI2 or the latest Mistral work. So love to see the level of speed at which people work, but we've consistently seen, particularly Alibaba's work from Qwen, and now DeepSeek just top our leaderboard. And now, yes, we're gonna get into DeepSeek, everybody. This is, again, from last week, so I do not have the AI2 or the Mistral benchmarks on here. One of our incredible team members ran some agentic benchmarks on GPT-4o, Claude 3.5 Sonnet, and DeepSeek, and as you know, it's pretty darn good. So there's a lot of takes, and there's a lot of bad takes about DeepSeek. Pretend you didn't see that, it's a build. A lot of what I've been seeing as the implications for DeepSeek are, of course, compute. And one thing that we've seen when we're running evaluations is how cost-intensive inference is. And you sometimes just kind of conk out on your evaluation because the thinking tokens just take so much. And now we're seeing that popularity. People love to see reasoning, but it does affect not just the cost, but how well you're able to evaluate these models. The training data, part of why we're replicating, is looking into this question of synthetic data. Hugging Face has seen a lot of utility with synthetic data, with small LM, for example, but haven't seen that released, but excited to see where that goes from our team. The open side of it, as I said, open weight is not inherently more accessible to others, but the fact that this is so relatively easy to host goes a really long way. Also, hosting it yourself is a very different thing than using the app, which has had some misinformation and misunderstandings in what data is being delivered to whom. And of course, release is more than just the weight. So the DeepSeek team did release their training techniques, which we've seen had already a huge impact in the direction that researchers are looking. The fact that R10 only used reinforcement learning without supervised fine-tuning is quite significant in where people are investing their time. I do think this is often overlooked in releases overall, and there's valid reasons not to share, but it is seriously affected the level of investment in reinforcement learning today. And of course, the distribution side. I'm very curious to see the level of integration, also with the level of attention being given to DeepSeek, how much we're going to see small, highly performant models be integrated into global infrastructure, what that means for soft power, and what that means for global tensions, I guess is the best way to put it on this big stage. Geopolitics of it all. I want to leave you with some common ground because it's not all bleak. There's a lot that we actually have to work together on. There's a lot of shared venues. I think part of what's incredible is that Hugging Face is able to host so many models around the world. We're able to evaluate all of them, compare them, see how useful they are to different use cases. I loved seeing the many peoples who were at NeurIPS, and even in Shanghai, we saw a lot of publications from Chinese labs at more of these Western conferences. But I really hope that these Western conferences can make their information more accessible to the rest of the world. There's shared fora, really glad to see everybody here at the summit, but also in more of the bigger fora like the UN. I have seen more Chinese attention being given to the UN as a forum. And public infrastructure, we're really interested, and we're going to be supporting the launch on Tuesday. I don't think I'm allowed to say more than that, but I would keep tuned for the launch coming from the summit team. Coming on back, here we are, landing. This is what I want to leave you with. I hope this is helpful to you as researchers, to you as policymakers. There's a lot of ways that we have common ground geopolitically, but also from our different backgrounds. Thanks so much. Do we have some time for questions? If anybody has questions, I'm here. Okay. Great. Yeah, I think we have some microphones over there.
Version does do some sorts of censorship on China-related topics. But then there's been some quite aggressive proposals in Congress, for instance, in the US. Do you think those will get traction? I think I was most distressed to see the head of Anthropic calling for tighter restrictions on open models. I think that's, I appreciate their safety approach, and I think they've done a great job, but calling for restrictions is really something else. That also seems that it raises some risk of that quite, I would say, inappropriate legislation that might enforce monopoly rights for closed providers to get greater traction. Anyway, it's a set of issues. Perhaps you could just address whatever you like among those.
Thanks so much. There's a lot to unpack there. I'm going to talk about the DC reception and then and I guess export controls. So on DC reception, DC policymakers have quite a bit going on right now and a lot on their plate, and it's not necessarily their job to really dig into all aspects of a release. So I've seen some bad takes on if you download DeepSeek, where does your data go? And this is I think, on the technical community's burden to really explain what downloading a model means, what it means to host that on US servers, and what that means to download the app. One of the most popular apps now, interestingly, Alibaba's Qwen model is not, to my knowledge, available on the major US servers, but DeepSeek now is. Hugging Face hosts DeepSeek, for example, so I hope that if people are going to use it, that there is comfort in at least DC understanding where that data is going. And on the export control side, restrictions on model weights, particularly export controls on model weights, are a bad idea for multiple reasons. One of the biggest reasons that I'm now grappling with is that broader integration. So you're seeing these small models, largely from Chinese labs, be integrated into global infrastructure, and they're very impressive. And if the US or other countries were to make less accessible these open weight models, that is a soft power question. That is, where are you able to deploy? On the export control side, particularly on hardware as well, there are ways to train on infrastructure that's not necessarily US, and this is where we're talking about inference. So we've seen DeepSeek use Huawei chips, for example, and inference being particularly costly. We have public and private models on the hub, and we've seen utility in opening and closing many different types of models, but it would be pretty harmful to the overall ecosystem, not just, and this is just focusing on model weights, to close model weights. I don't have strong enough views on particularly export controls for hardware, because I think you need to look more deeply at what type of hardware. DeepSeek was not trained on H100s, and again, they're not using H100s for inference. But on the model weights specifically, there's a lot of ways that people are building off of what is being released to build better models, and we've just seen a lot of rifts. We have over 1,500 variations of DeepSeek on Hugging Face already. We have tens of thousands of variations of Llama already, and we've just seen that be really helpful to research and science generally. I don't know the system.
I don't know if it's on. Is this on? Thank you. Thank you, Irene, for the presentation. I'm really interested in the open source work and the openness of Hugging Face, and I have a lot of questions about shareable repositories for evaluations. In our work for evaluating safety cases, and this is also interesting for the UK AC presentation, sharing safety cases and evaluations of them there's a tension with sharing the data that's used to evaluate the safety cases, and I was wondering if you could talk more about that tension with sharing evaluations and sharing data used to evaluate safety, and where Hugging Face might be in that.
Thanks for asking that, because I think it's often left out of this release question as something that's tangential. I think everybody's got a take, and Irene's take is that I think once an evaluation set exists, it's kind of out there to be trained on. So, but there are multiple reasons, and this is specifically from my worldview of it's really helpful to release test sets, so you can understand test train overlap, so that other people can do meta-analyses on your evaluation sets. We've seen this, for example, with Anthropic's persuasion data set on Hugging Face, and Anthropic has like such a badass, societal impact team, and also there are people outside of the company who can do these meta-analyses that maybe they don't have the same people to do. So I think part of the reasons and the hesitancy to release evaluation sets are also valid, and something that I've discussed with the ML Commons team, for example, is maybe stage releasing those test sets. But I've been curious to see more effort on these kinds of generative prompts, like with LiveBench. I know that that's also pretty cost intensive to build, but if you're doing like new prompts, creating new evaluations, I wonder if that's one approach to avoiding circumventing this fear of test train overlap. I know Stanford's been doing a lot on reporting your test train overlap as well.
So this is not going to be a new question, but I'm very, very curious for your answer. So in a fully open sourced world, what is the best, most comprehensive argument on how we ensure safety that we can make? And I think you're probably one of the best people in the world to articulate that argument. So to recap, the obvious reason for the containment, a proposition of models in proprietary hands, is that when they get capable enough, either because they can be misused or because they're misaligned, maybe we don't do it now because we don't understand the risk, but when we get there, maybe there is a hope that everybody will come together and slow things down and contain them, right? So On the other side, in the fully open source world, the arguments I hear are probably twofold. One, the pragmatic one. So, we're not going to contain this technology. Let's face reality. It's all going to be open source. So let's face that and do something in that world. And then there is the purely defense play. So if everything is open sourced, what we can do on the safety side is up our defenses. But we know that doesn't really work very well. In cybersecurity, definitely doesn't work very well where power is diffuse, like terrorism, right? So if everybody can do something really bad, then it's not enough to be able to just defend ourselves if we can't contain it. So I really buy into the positive side of open source, but I'm not sure I understand or I'm fully convinced by how we do the safety part, besides those two arguments that I find only partially convincing. So I'm curious for what your argument would be.
So I want to be really specific about terms. And on the open source side, I think there's a lot that there's reasons not to share. I think there's a lot of sensitive data if you're putting into a training data set. If you get that, and I hope that there are better processes and documentation for understanding how training data is sourced. But when we're open sourcing everything, better analyses is really helpful, but maybe shouldn't be accessible to everybody. I think there's really great work from OpenMind, for example, that's looking at how to securely be able to evaluate components of systems. But on open weight world, and if everything were to be open weighted, I don't know who necessarily advocates for that. I pretty uncharitably call some of those folks open source libertarians. And there's plenty of reasons. One of the most triggering examples on Hugging Face Hub that I can only now start to talk about is GPT 4chan. And that was like a pretty ugly model. 4chan's a pretty ugly part of the internet. And I think it's fine if people don't use it. And I think it's fine if that's not accessible to everybody. It's something that we took down from the hub. On the safety side, I think this is part of this is why the point that I'm making on accessibility and why I'm so curious about this movement more towards small, higher performant models. If people are able to access these highly performant models, especially on their own devices, I do think that changes the landscape quite a bit, especially for different modalities. I do find some of these, like I wasn't able to spin up Hunyuan by myself. It's quite compute intensive, and the people that affects is different. So I think it depends on the modality. I do really believe in the different viewpoints, and especially peoples who don't have as much compute infrastructure, who are able to do really great red teaming or analyses on open models. I found so many insights that I would never have thought of that way.
Hi, thank you for the really excellent talk. The question I want to ask is about post-deployment monitoring for open weight models in cases of hazards, risks, incidents, harms, etc. So recently, Anthropic published a paper called Clio, where they were looking at uses and potential indicators of harms with their proprietary Claude models, which is feasible to do because it's centralized data and curated through an API, etc. But then with open weight models, as you say, where they can be downloaded, where they can be distributed, etc., by merit of not being centralized, it's much harder to then figure out A, what are the uses, B, what are the things which could be going wrong, etc. And in my view, it's important to be able to do that because evaluations are great, but evaluations are data at point one in time. It'd be great to be in a world where we have much more data in this regard. So the challenging question I have is, what could you think of what do you think maybe some innovative approaches towards trying to gather this data for open weight models, despite like the technical constraints where they're like available at scale, maybe leveraging the community, maybe leveraging other things. It feels important, feels like a step that's needed to be brought forward. Would be great to see some thoughts and leadership, and yeah, because it's probably also doable.
Yeah, so one, I think, valid criticism of Hugging Face is that it is centralized for a decentralized repository. And that is necessary in some regard because you have to have a place to be able to do those downloads. But as we've seen with this room and with different, I'm curious if we do this large-scale study, I don't think a lot of people spin up on their own hardware. Can we do this one more time? How many people spun up a model on some externally hosted hardware? And how many of you did it like literally the hardware was with you yourself? Okay, show-offs. Like, I don't do that. I don't have that money. I don't have that infrastructure. And I think far fewer people do. this is a biased result. But I do think that, and I would encourage somebody to do that level of scale. I think that a lot of folks who are doing this type of evaluation work, the infrastructure via API is just so much easier. It's so much better. And if you do that in a centralized way, I think even with red teaming results from these DEF CON events, being able to do that on open weight models without any filters, without anything on top of that, and being able to collect that is hugely, hugely helpful in ways where if you're going via API with a filter, maybe you're not understanding what exactly you're evaluating, and there has to be some way. I think this is. I'm not fully certain. I don't think anybody's certain. So I think open question. If you do have this, please let me know what proportion of people are downloading, because it's not on. People are not downloading the biggest weights on Hugging Face. They're doing the small ones, and they're not right now as highly performant as like the 405B. Even AI2's Tulu 3 was 405B, and that's no small feat to run. All right, thanks so much.